Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving down that old highway late one night, coming back from a long day of deliveries. It was dark, the kind of dark where you can't see anything beyond the reach of your headlights. I was just looking forward to getting home, maybe having a cold beer before crashing into bed. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, next to a beat-up car with its hood up. The hazard lights were blinking, casting an eerie glow on her pale face. She looked desperate, waving her arms as I approached. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was because she looked so helpless, or maybe I was just too tired to think straight. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need some help?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide and pleading. "My car broke down. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" "It's not far." I hesitated for a second, but then she started to shiver in the cold night air. "All right, get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. She climbed in, clutching her coat around her. "Thank you so much." I didn't know what I was going to do. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out endlessly in front of us. I tried to make small talk, but she was quiet, just staring out the window. Something about her was starting to make me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then, out of nowhere, she started to fidget, glancing at her phone. "Can you pull over here?" she asked suddenly. "I need to make a call." It was an odd request, but I did as she asked. We were in the middle of nowhere, no lights, no houses, just trees and darkness. She stepped out of the truck, walking a few paces away. I could see her silhouette in the headlights, her breath visible in the cold air. I waited, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. Something didn't feel right. She was taking too long. My mind started racing with all kinds of thoughts. Why would she need to make a call out here? Why couldn't it wait until we got to town? Then I saw it. Movement in the trees. Another figure, creeping closer to my truck. My heart started pounding. This was a setup. Before I could react, the woman was back at the door, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked sweetly. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just fine." "Let's get going." She hesitated, looking back toward the trees. I saw a flash of worry in her eyes, but she climbed back in. As soon as she was in, I hit the gas, the truck lurching forward. I saw the other figure break into a run, chasing us for a few yards before giving up. "What's the hurry?" she asked, her voice tense. I didn't answer, just kept my eyes on the road. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I had to get to a populated area, somewhere safe. We drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following us, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the next town. I pulled into a gas station, the bright lights a welcome relief. I turned to her, my heart still pounding. "This is as far as I can take you." She looked at me, her eyes hard and cold now. "Thanks," she said, her voice flat. She got out of the truck without another word, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, my mind replaying everything that had happened. I knew I had been lucky. If I hadn't seen that figure in the trees, things could have ended very differently. I got back on the road, heading home with my mind still racing. The encounter left me shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to danger. It was a stark reminder that you never really know who you're dealing with, even when they seem like they need your help. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and double-checked the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't sleep much that night, every little noise making me jump. The next day, I reported the incident to the local police, giving them a description of the woman and what had happened. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't hold out much hope of catching her. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night started to fade. But I never stopped being cautious, always watching my surroundings, always thinking twice before stopping to help a stranger. That night changed me. It made me realize how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can find yourself in a situation you never expected. It was a lesson in trust, in caution, and in the darker side of human nature. I still drive that same route sometimes, but I'm always on edge, always looking out for anyone who might need help. But now, I think twice before stopping, and I never let my guard down. It's a hard way to live, but it's better than the alternative. And every now and then, I think about that woman, about what might have happened if I hadn't seen that figure in the trees. I was driving home late one night, the kind of night where the road stretches out endlessly and you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I had just left my friend's house after a late dinner, and the roads were empty. The glow of my headlights was the only thing cutting through the darkness. It was peaceful, just the hum of my car and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Then, I noticed it. A car was behind me, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I drove, the car stayed right on my tail, too close for comfort. I tried to brush off the growing sense of unease. Maybe it was just someone in a hurry, but something about it felt off. I changed lanes, thinking they'd pass. But they didn't. They mirrored my move, staying right behind me. My heart started to race. I sped up a bit, hoping to put some distance between us. But the car sped up too. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was past midnight. Who would be out here, following me? I decided to take the next exit, a quieter road that led through a wooded area. Maybe I could lose them there. But as I made the turn, they did too. Their headlights were still glaring in my rearview mirror, closer now, almost blinding. Panic started to set in. I pressed down on the gas, my car lurching forward. The road was winding, trees closing in on both sides. I couldn't see any houses, no place to pull over and find help. The car behind me started to swerve, inching closer, trying to force me off the road. My mind was racing. What did they want? Why were they doing this? I couldn't let them catch me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The car bumped into my rear, a jolt that sent a shock of fear through me. I had to do something. Up ahead, I saw a narrow dirt road branching off. I took a sharp turn, my tires skidding on the gravel. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. But then, their headlights reappeared, barreling down the road after me. I drove faster, the rough path making my car bounce and shake. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The road twisted and turned, and I could barely keep control. But I couldn't stop, not with them right behind me. I saw a bend up ahead, a sharp turn. I knew I had to take it just right or risk crashing. I slowed down just enough to make the turn, my car skidding on the loose gravel. The car behind me wasn't so lucky. They took the turn too fast, their headlights veering off the road and into the trees. I didn't wait to see what happened. I just kept driving, my mind focused on getting as far away as possible. I drove until I reached a small town, its streets quiet and empty. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I parked the car. I looked around, half expecting to see those headlights again. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the night and the flickering neon sign of the gas station. I got out of the car, my legs trembling. I went inside, the bright lights and the smell of coffee a strange comfort. The attendant looked at me, probably noticing the fear in my eyes. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but my voice was shaky. "Yeah, just had a rough drive." I stayed there for a while, trying to calm down. I called a friend to come pick me up. There was no way I was getting back on the road alone that night. When my friend arrived, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We drove back to my place, the ride silent except for my racing thoughts. I never found out who was driving that car or why they were following me. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I started taking different routes home, always checking my rearview mirror, always on edge. It changed the way I drove, the way I thought about being out alone at night. It was a late Friday night, and I was driving back home from a long week of work. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional car passing by. I was tired, eager to get home and just collapse into bed. That's when I saw him, standing by the side of the road, his thumb out. A hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about him seemed harmless. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans, carrying a small backpack. Maybe he was just down on his luck and needed a ride. I slowed down and pulled over. "Hey there, where are you headed?" I asked as he leaned in through the window. "Just a few miles up the road," he replied with a friendly smile. "If it's not too much trouble." "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. He climbed in, thanking me. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement. He seemed normal enough, making small talk about the weather and how quiet the roads were at night. After a while, the conversation died down, and he seemed to get more comfortable. He asked if I had a cigarette, and I handed him one from my glove compartment. He lit it, taking a deep drag, and stared out the window. "So, what do you do?" he asked, exhaling smoke. "Just office work," I replied. "Nothing too exciting." He nodded, then there was another long silence. I started to feel uneasy, the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. "You know," he said suddenly, his tone changing, "it's not often people stop for hitchhikers these days. Too many crazies out there." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess so. But you seemed all right." "Seemed," he repeated, a strange smile playing on his lips. My unease grew. There was something off about the way he said that. I glanced at him, and for the first time, noticed how tense he seemed, like he was coiled and ready to spring. "Where did you say you were heading again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just up ahead," he said vaguely, waving a hand. "I'll tell you when to stop." Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The road was completely deserted now, not a single car in sight. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, his movements becoming more erratic. I kept one eye on the road and one on him, my heart pounding. Suddenly, he lunged, grabbing the steering wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching. I fought to regain control, wrestling the wheel from his grip. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. He didn't answer, just kept trying to steer us off the road. I managed to push him back into his seat, but he was strong, his eyes wild and desperate. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, pulling a knife from his jacket. The blade glinted in the dim light from the dashboard. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. We both jolted forward, the seatbelts locking us in place. Before he could react, I unclipped my belt and threw myself at him, trying to wrestle the knife from his hand. We struggled, the confined space making it hard to move. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain as the blade grazed my arm. I gritted my teeth, grabbing his wrist with both hands and slamming it against the door. The knife clattered to the floor. He was stronger than he looked, and he started to get the upper hand, pinning me against the seat. I felt his hands around my throat, squeezing, cutting off my air. I kicked out blindly, my foot connecting with his knee. He yelled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled for the door handle, flinging it open and tumbling out onto the road. I could hear him cursing, the sound of the knife scraping as he picked it up. I got to my feet, the cool night air hitting my face, and started running. I didn't look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way to escape. The road was empty, no lights, no houses, just darkness. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff, a narrow path leading into the woods. I veered off the road, hoping to lose him in the trees. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I pushed through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I kept running, my legs burning, my heart pounding. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I saw a fallen tree up ahead, its massive trunk lying across the path. I scrambled over it, glancing back for the first time. I could see his shadowy figure in the distance, his pace slowing as he looked around, trying to find me. I crouched behind the tree, trying to catch my breath and stay silent. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I watched as he moved closer, the knife glinting in his hand. He stopped just a few feet away, looking around, his breathing heavy. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. He cursed again, kicking at the dirt, and then he started to move away, back towards the road. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then slowly stood up. My legs were shaking, my whole body trembling. I had to get back to the car, had to get out of there. I started making my way back through the woods, moving as quietly as I could. When I finally reached the road, it was empty. My car was still there, the door hanging open. I glanced around, but there was no sign of him. I ran to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling. The attendant looked at me with concern as I walked in, probably seeing the cuts and bruises. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. "I need to call the police." He handed me the phone, and I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They told me to stay put and wait for an officer to arrive. As I sat there, waiting, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to losing my life. I'd picked up a hitchhiker, trying to do a good deed, and it had almost cost me everything. I knew I'd never forget that night, the terror and the desperation. When the police arrived, they took my statement and promised to look for the man. I thanked them, but I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe again. I was driving home late one night, the highway empty and the darkness pressing in on all sides. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of a passing car. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I was almost home. Just a few more miles. Suddenly, I saw flashing blue lights in my rearview mirror. My heart jumped. I hadn't been speeding, so I wasn't sure why I was being pulled over. I signaled and pulled to the side of the road, stopping my car. The light stopped behind me, and I saw a silhouette step out of the vehicle. The man approached my window. I rolled it down, feeling a little anxious. He was wearing a uniform, but something about it seemed off. The badge didn't look right, and his face was partly shadowed by the brim of his hat. "License and registration," he said, his voice gruff. I handed over my documents, my hand shaking slightly. He took them without a word, shining a flashlight in my face. The light was blinding, and I had to look away. "What's the problem, officer?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking at my license. Then he glanced at me, his eyes cold. "Step out of the car." Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Something wasn't right. "Why?" I asked, my voice higher than I intended. "Step out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Every instinct was telling me not to get out, but I didn't know what else to do. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out. The night air was cold, and I shivered. He moved closer, the flashlight now aimed at my chest. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." "What?" I said, my heart racing. What did I do? "Just do it," he snapped. I turned and placed my hands on the roof of the car, feeling vulnerable and exposed. I heard him moving behind me, the crunch of gravel under his boots. Suddenly, I felt a rough hand grab my wrist, yanking it behind my back. Panic surged through me. "Wait, what are you doing?" He didn't answer, just pulled my other arm back, pinning me against the car. I struggled, fear taking over. This wasn't right. He wasn't a real cop. "Please, let me go," I begged, my voice shaking. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my neck. "Shut up," he hissed. I felt something cold and hard against my wrist, handcuffs. My heart pounded in my chest as he secured them tightly, the metal biting into my skin. He dragged me to his car, opening the back door. I tried to resist, but he was too strong. He shoved me inside and slammed the door. I was trapped. The interior of his car was dark, the windows tinted. I could barely see anything. I heard him get into the driver's seat, the engine starting up. We began to move, leaving my car behind. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just kept driving. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but my mind was racing. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was going to do. After what felt like an eternity, the car stopped. He got out, coming around to open my door. He yanked me out, the handcuffs cutting into my wrists. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees. No lights, no houses, nothing. "Please," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Let me go." He ignored me, dragging me towards a small cabin I hadn't noticed before. It was dark and looked abandoned. He kicked the door open and shoved me inside. I stumbled, falling to the floor. The room was bare, just a single chair in the middle. He hauled me to my feet and pushed me into the chair, securing my wrists to the back with the handcuffs. "Why are you doing this?" I sobbed, my voice breaking. He stood over me, a sinister smile on his face. "Because I can," he said simply. He left the room, locking the door behind him. I was alone, my mind racing. I had to get out. I struggled against the cuffs, but they were too tight. My wrists were raw and bleeding. I looked around, desperate for something, anything that could help me. The room was empty, no windows, just a single door. I heard him moving around outside, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. I had to think. I had to stay calm. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. I remembered my phone in my pocket. Maybe I could reach it. I twisted my body, trying to get my hand into my pocket. It was difficult with the cuffs, but I managed to get my fingers on the edge of my phone. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it out. My heart pounded as I dialed 911, praying for a signal. It rang once, twice, then I heard a voice. 911, what's your emergency? Help, I whispered, my voice shaking. I've been kidnapped. Please, help me. The operator asked for my location, but I had no idea where I was. I described the road I had been on, the small cabin. She told me to stay on the line, that help was on the way. I heard him coming back, and I quickly hid the phone under my leg. He entered the room, a twisted smile on his face. "Who are you talking to?" he demanded, grabbing my hair and yanking my head back. "No one," I lied, my heart racing. He searched me, finding the phone. His face twisted in anger, and he threw it across the room. It shattered against the wall. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he snarled. "But no one's coming for you." I felt a surge of despair, but I couldn't give up. I had to survive. I had to get out of there. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. He left me alone, locked in the room. I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. My heart leapt. They had found me. He heard them too. Panic flashed in his eyes, and he grabbed his gun, looking at me with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, before running out the back door. Moments later, the police burst in, freeing me from the chair. I collapsed into their arms, relief flooding through me. They had found me in time. They took me to the hospital, treated my wounds, and assured me he would be caught. We were driving back from a weekend trip, laughing and chatting, when we saw the tree blocking the road. It was a huge oak, lying across the pavement, completely cutting off our path. The headlights lit up the scene, casting long shadows into the woods on either side. "Guess we have to move it," Jake said, pulling over. The engine's hum died, leaving an eerie silence. The forest was dense and dark, making me uneasy. "Let's make it quick," I said, opening my door. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. We all got out. The air was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter. As we approached the tree, I heard rustling in the bushes. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off as a deer or some small animal. "Okay, let's do this," Sarah said, bending down to grab a branch. We all joined her, trying to lift the tree or at least move it enough to get the car through. Just then, we heard footsteps behind us. Before I could turn around, someone grabbed me from behind, covering my mouth with a rough, gloved hand. I struggled, but he was strong. "Don't move," a voice hissed in my ear. I froze. Around me, my friends were being grabbed too. There were at least 4 men, maybe more, emerging from the shadows. "Just take what you want," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We don't have much, but you can have it." The man holding me laughed, a harsh, cold sound. "Oh, we'll take everything." They forced us to the ground, tying our hands behind our backs with rough rope. My wrists burned as the rope cut into my skin. They took our wallets, phones, and jewelry. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his face, seemed to be in charge. "Get the keys," he ordered, and one of the men rifled through Jake's pockets, pulling out the car keys. "Please, just let us go," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. The scarred man crouched down in front of her, smiling. "We're not done yet." He stood up, kicking Sarah in the ribs. She cried out in pain, and I felt a surge of anger and fear. This wasn't just a robbery. They wanted to hurt us. "Load them in the car," the scarred man said. "We're going for a ride." They dragged us to our own car, shoving us into the back seat. Jake was in the front, with one of the men holding a gun to his head, forcing him to drive. The rest of us were crammed in the back, with 2 of the men keeping a close watch on us. "Where are you taking us?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You'll see," the scarred man said from the front seat. We drove for what felt like hours, deeper into the woods. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but I couldn't see any opportunity. The men were too alert, too ready for any move we might make. Finally, we stopped at an old, abandoned cabin. The men dragged us out of the car and into the building. It was dark and smelled of mold and rot. They shoved us into a small room and locked the door. "Stay quiet," the scarred man said. "We'll be back." We sat in the dark, our breaths loud in the silence. "We have to get out of here," Jake whispered. "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They took everything." "We need to find something to cut these ropes," I said, feeling around the room with my bound hands. My fingers brushed against something sharp, a piece of broken glass. Carefully, I picked it up and started sawing at the ropes around my wrists. It took forever, but finally, the ropes fell away. I quickly freed the others. "We need to move quietly," I whispered. They could be right outside. We crept to the door, listening for any sounds. When we heard nothing, Jake slowly opened it. The hallway was empty, but we could hear voices from another room. We had to be quick. We moved silently, sticking close to the walls. The front door was just ahead. Freedom was so close, but then we heard footsteps behind us. One of the men had spotted us. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted for the door, bursting out into the night. Behind us, the men shouted, giving chase. My heart pounded as we ran through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. We ran and ran until we could barely breathe, but we couldn't stop. We could still hear them behind us. The moonlight barely lit our path, making it hard to see where we were going. Suddenly, we stumbled upon a road. I saw headlights in the distance and waved my arms frantically. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver jumped out. "Help us!" I cried. He took one look at our terrified faces and hurried us into his car. We drove away, leaving the men behind in the darkness. We made it to the nearest town and went straight to the police. They took our statements and went to search for the men, but I don't know if they ever found them. That night changed everything. I still can't drive down a dark road without feeling a chill, remembering those eyes in the shadows. I was driving home late that night, the sky pitch black and the road almost empty. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the occasional flash of headlights from distant cars. I was looking forward to getting home and sinking into bed after a long day at work. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a scene that made me slow down. There was a car, flipped on its side, its front end crumpled against a tree. Smoke was rising from the hood, and the hazard lights were blinking weakly. I pulled over, my heart pounding. I couldn't just drive past. Someone might need help. I grabbed my phone and got out of my car. The night air was cool, and I could hear the distant chirping of crickets. I approached the wreck cautiously, calling out, "Is anyone there? Are you okay?" I heard a groan and quickened my pace. As I got closer, I saw a man slumped against the driver's seat, his face obscured by blood and shadows. "Hang on, I'm calling for help," I said, dialing 911. The operator picked up, and I quickly explained the situation, giving them the location. The man stirred, mumbling something I couldn't understand. I leaned in closer. "What's that? Are you hurt bad?" I asked. Suddenly, a loud bang came from behind me. I spun around, and my heart sank. Two men, dressed in dark clothes and wearing ski masks, were standing there. One of them had a gun pointed at me. "Don't move," the man with the gun said, his voice cold and steady. I raised my hand slowly, my phone slipping from my grasp and hitting the ground. "I'm just trying to help," I stammered. "Yeah, we saw," the other man said, his eyes glinting behind the mask. "Now you're gonna help us." They marched me back to my car, one of them picking up my phone and tossing it into the bushes. "Get in the driver's seat," the man with the gun ordered. I did as I was told, my hands shaking. They climbed in, one in the passenger seat and the other in the back, still pointing the gun at me. "Drive," the passenger said. "And don't try anything stupid." I started the car, my mind racing. This was a setup. They'd staged the accident to lure someone in, and I'd fallen for it. I drove down the dark road, following their directions, my stomach in knots. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll find out soon enough," the man in the back said, pressing the gun against the back of my seat. After what felt like an eternity, they had me turn onto a dirt road, leading deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the headlights. Finally, we stopped in front of an old, abandoned cabin. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, its windows broken and the wood rotting. "Out," the passenger said, motioning with the gun. "And don't even think about running." We got out, and they led me inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of mold. They tied me to a chair in the middle of the room, using some old rope they found. My wrists burned as the rough fibers bit into my skin. "Now," the man with the gun said, pulling off his mask, revealing a scarred face, "let's talk about what you have that's valuable." "I don't have anything," I said, my voice trembling. "Just my car and my phone." "Liar," he snapped, backhanding me across the face. Pain exploded in my cheek, and I tasted blood. "Everyone has something." They started going through my pockets, taking my wallet and keys. They found my credit cards, my driver's license, and a bit of cash. "This is it?" the other man asked, pulling off his mask too. He was younger, with wild eyes and a cruel smile. "Yes, that's it," I said, wincing as the pain in my cheek throbbed. The scarred man looked at my license. "David, huh?" "Well, David, you're gonna help us get some money. Call your bank. Tell them you lost your card and need cash." "They won't do it this late," I protested. "The bank's closed." He hit me again, harder this time, Try anyway." With shaking hands, I called the number on the back of my card, putting it on speaker. After navigating the automated system, I finally got a representative. "I need to withdraw cash," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't process that request over the phone at this hour. You'll need to visit a branch in the morning," the representative said. The scarred man cursed and ended the call. "You're lying," he said, grabbing my hair and yanking my head back. "You're gonna get us that money, one way or another." They kept me there for hours, trying different ways to get money from my accounts. They threatened me, hit me, and even tried to make me call friends and family for ransom. But it was the middle of the night, and no one was answering. Finally, the younger man got frustrated and kicked over a chair. "This is a waste of time," he said. "We need to get out of here before someone comes looking for him." The scarred man nodded, looking at me with a sneer. "You're lucky, David. But if you tell anyone about this, we'll find you. Understand?" I nodded, my heart pounding. They cut the ropes, leaving my wrists raw and bleeding. "Get in your car and drive," the scarred man said. "And remember, we're watching." I stumbled out of the cabin, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I could barely see through the tears in my eyes. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, pulling into a gas station and calling the police. They came quickly, and I told them everything. They took my statement and went to search the cabin, but the men were long gone. I was driving home late one night, the road stretching out like a dark ribbon before me. I was tired, the kind of tired that makes your eyes heavy and your thoughts slow. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the deserted road. I almost didn't see him. A jogger out in the middle of nowhere, his figure suddenly appearing in my headlights. I swerved, my heart leaping into my throat. The car screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the asphalt. For a moment, everything was silent except for the pounding of my heart. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the jogger standing there, illuminated by the red glow of my brake lights. He was just standing there, staring at me. Something about it felt off. Who jogs in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? I hesitated, but then I thought maybe he was hurt. Maybe I had clipped him with my car. I took a deep breath and got out, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of cold water. "Are you okay?" I called out, walking toward him. He didn't answer. As I got closer, I saw his face. He was grinning, but it wasn't a friendly grin. It was more like a predatory smile. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling with shock and fear. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I struggled, kicking and clawing, trying to break free. "Get off me!" I finally managed to scream, using my other hand to push against his chest. He was strong, much stronger than I expected. His eyes were wild, filled with a manic intensity that terrified me. I remembered my car keys in my pocket. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I reached into my pocket and jabbed the keys into his side. He howled in pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to wrench free. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding away from that nightmare. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of the nearest gas station. Once there, I parked under the bright lights and sat in the car, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking, my mind racing. I knew I had to call the police, so I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice helped steady my nerves a little. I told her what had happened, every detail tumbling out in a rush. She assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay where I was. When the police arrived, I felt a wave of relief. I explained everything to the officer, who took my statement with a serious expression. He said they would search the area and advised me to go home and lock my doors. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the terrifying grin behind me. I finally made it home and locked every door and window. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The police called later to say they had found no trace of the man. It was like he had vanished into thin air. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That grin. It haunted my dreams, turning them into nightmares. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, but it didn't help much. The fear had burrowed deep into my mind. Over time, the fear faded a little, but I never forgot that night. I stopped driving on that road and avoided being out late whenever I could. The world felt a little less safe, and I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I never found out who he was or why he was there. Maybe he was just a random lunatic, or maybe he had been waiting for someone like me. I'll never know. But I do know one thing for sure. I was lucky to get away. I was driving home late one night. The highway was empty, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. A man was standing next to it, waving me down. He looked desperate. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to pull over and see if he needed help. As I got out of my car, I could see the worry on his face. He thanked me for stopping and said his car had broken down. He asked if I had a jack he could borrow. I nodded and went to the trunk of my car to get it. As I handed it to him, I heard a noise behind me. Before I could turn around, I felt something hard hit the back of my head, and I fell to the ground, dazed. I tried to get up, but my vision was blurry, and my head was throbbing. The man who had asked for help was now standing over me, along with another man who must have been hiding nearby. They started searching my pockets, taking my wallet and phone. I tried to fight back, but I was too weak and disoriented. "Get him in the car," one of them said. They dragged me to their car and shoved me into the back seat. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to do something to get out of this situation. I waited for them to get in and start driving. As we sped down the highway, I began to regain some of my strength. I glanced around the car, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing within reach. I needed a plan. I decided to pretend to be more injured than I was. I slumped over, closed my eyes, and tried to make it seem like I was unconscious. I heard them talking in the front seat, discussing what to do next. "Should we just dump him somewhere?" one of them asked. "Not yet," the other replied. "We need to make sure he doesn't call the cops." I knew I had to act fast. I slowly reached for the door handle, trying not to make any noise. The door was unlocked. I took a deep breath and threw it open, rolling out of the car onto the pavement. The car screeched to a halt, and I heard them shouting. I forced myself to my feet and started running as fast as I could into the woods by the side of the road. Branches scratched my face and arms as I pushed through the trees. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the underbrush, yelling for me to stop. My heart was pounding, and my lungs were burning, but I kept running. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Eventually, their voices faded, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I kept moving, not sure where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between us as possible. After what felt like hours, I finally stopped to catch my breath. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same in the dark. I knew I needed to find help. I started walking, hoping to find a road or a house, somewhere I could call the police. After a while, I saw a faint light through the trees. I headed toward it, praying it wasn't another trap. As I got closer, I realized it was a small farmhouse. I approached cautiously and knocked on the door. An elderly couple answered, their faces filled with concern when they saw me. I quickly explained what had happened, and they let me inside. They called the police, and I sat down, my whole body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. The couple gave me some water and a blanket, trying to calm me down. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they would search for the men who had attacked me. I felt a little safer, but I knew I wouldn't truly relax until they were caught. The police drove me home, and I thanked them for their help. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being seriously hurt or worse. It was late, and I was driving home after visiting my parents. The road was empty, and I was starting to feel the exhaustion set in. The headlights of my car were the only thing cutting through the darkness. I noticed some orange cones and a sign that said construction ahead. I hadn't seen anything about roadwork on this route, but I didn't think much of it. I slowed down as I approached the zone. The road narrowed, and there were barriers up. A man in a reflective vest waved a flashlight, signaling me to stop. I rolled down my window, and he came over, telling me there was a detour and I'd need to take a side road. His voice sounded strange, but I just nodded and followed his directions. The detour led me onto a dirt road that seemed to go deeper into the woods. I started to feel uneasy. There were no other cars around, and the trees seemed to close in on me. Suddenly, I saw more cones ahead and another person in a vest waving me down. I slowed to a stop, and before I knew it, 3 men surrounded my car. One of them yanked the door open and pulled me out. I tried to scream, but another man clamped his hand over my mouth. They dragged me away from the car, and I struggled, but they were too strong. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't think straight. They tied my hands behind my back and pushed me to the ground. One of them started going through my car while the others kept watch over me. I could see them rifling through my belongings, taking my purse, phone, and anything valuable. I tried to plead with them, but they just ignored me. I felt a wave of panic. I didn't know what they planned to do next, but I knew I had to get away. The men were talking amongst themselves, not paying close attention to me. I took a deep breath and started to work on the ropes binding my hands. My fingers were shaking, and it felt impossible, but I had to try. After what seemed like an eternity, I felt the ropes loosen. I glanced up to see if they noticed, but they were still distracted. I waited for the right moment, then made a run for it. I sprinted into the woods, branches whipping against my face and arms. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My only thought was to get away. My legs were burning, and I could barely see where I was going, but I kept running. Eventually, the shouting faded, and I found myself alone in the dark forest. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the main road. I felt a sob rising in my throat, but I forced it down. I had to stay calm and figure out a plan. I remembered my phone was still in my pocket. Hands shaking, I pulled it out and saw that there was no signal. I wanted to scream in frustration, but I knew that would only give away my position. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a spot with better reception or stumble upon a house or road. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally saw a light in the distance. I moved towards it cautiously, not sure if it was safe. As I got closer, I saw it was a farmhouse with a light on the porch. I approached quietly and knocked on the door. An older woman answered, her eyes widening when she saw my disheveled state. I quickly explained what had happened, and she let me inside, locking the door behind us. She called the police, and I sat down, my whole body trembling. The woman brought me a blanket and some water, trying to comfort me. I could hear her talking to the dispatcher, her voice shaking. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They assured me they would search for the men and took me to the station to make a full report. I felt a little safer, but I couldn't shake the fear that had taken hold of me. The officers were kind and drove me home, promising to keep me updated on the investigation. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the men's faces and felt the panic all over again. I'm a lot better with it now, but still have flashbacks that wake me from my sleep. I was driving home late one night after a long day at work. The road was dark and empty, and I was just looking forward to getting home and falling into bed. Suddenly, I saw something on the side of the road that made me slow down. It looked like a car seat with a baby in it. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't just drive by and do nothing. I pulled over and turned on my hazard lights. The car seat was right on the edge of the road, and as I got closer, I could see the baby inside. It was eerily quiet. No car in sight, no other people around. My gut told me something was wrong, but I couldn't ignore the baby. I parked and got out, my eyes scanning the area as I walked towards the car seat. Just as I bent down to check on the baby, everything went black. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head and collapsed to the ground. When I came to, I was lying on my back, my vision blurry. The baby car seat was gone, and I realized too late that I had walked right into a trap. I tried to get up, but my hands and feet were tied. I looked around frantically and saw 3 men standing nearby, talking in hushed voices. They noticed I was awake and one of them walked over, his face twisted into a cruel smile. He had a knife, and he knelt down next to me, pressing the blade to my cheek. "Look what we have here," he said, his voice mocking. "Thought you were a hero, huh?" My mind was racing. I had to get out of this. I tried to stay calm and think of a way to escape, but the fear was overwhelming. The man with the knife grabbed my hair and yanked me to my feet. I could feel the cold steel of the blade against my skin as he dragged me towards their van. They shoved me inside and slammed the door shut. The interior was dark and smelled of gasoline and sweat. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear them talking outside, planning what to do with me. My mind went to dark places, thinking about all the horrible things that could happen. Minutes felt like hours, and I knew I had to do something. I looked around the van, hoping to find anything I could use to free myself. My fingers found a sharp piece of metal on the floor, maybe part of an old tool or something. I started to saw at the ropes binding my wrists, praying they wouldn't come back too soon. Finally, I felt the ropes give way. I quickly untied my feet and looked for a way out. The van doors were locked, but there was a small window at the back. I climbed over the seats and tried to open it, but it was stuck. I put all my strength into it, and it finally budged. I squeezed through the small opening, falling to the ground outside. I hit the pavement hard but didn't stop. I got up and ran as fast as I could into the woods. I could hear them shouting behind me, realizing I had escaped. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running. I didn't know where I was or where I was going. I just needed to get away. The trees provided some cover, but I could still hear them getting closer. I stumbled over roots and branches, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I saw a small clearing up ahead and sprinted towards it, hoping I could find some place to hide. As I reached the clearing, I saw a small cabin. The lights were off, and it looked abandoned, but I had no other choice. I ran to the door and pushed it open, slipping inside and closing it quietly behind me. I crouched down in the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear them searching the woods, their voices getting louder. They were angry and determined. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. I could hear footsteps outside the cabin, and my heart felt like it might stop. They tried the door, but it was locked from the inside. They pounded on it, but I stayed silent. Eventually, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. I crept to the window and peered outside, making sure they were gone. The forest was silent again, and I knew I had to get out of there. I slipped out of the cabin and made my way through the woods, careful to stay quiet. I kept moving until I found a road. I followed it until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, hoping it was someone who could help me. The car slowed down and pulled over. A woman rolled down the window, looking concerned. I told her what happened, and she called the police. They arrived quickly and took me to the station to make a statement. They promised to find the men who had done this, but I still felt a deep sense of fear. I knew it would take a long time to feel safe again. That night, I stayed at a friend's house, unable to be alone. I kept replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I could have been so naive. I never should have taken that turn. We were driving back from a late-night movie, and I thought I knew a shortcut. My girlfriend, Sarah, trusted me with the directions. The road started as a familiar one but quickly turned into a narrow, winding path with no streetlights. It was pitch dark, and the trees seemed to close in on us. The uneasiness began when the pavement ended. Gravel crunched under the tires, and the only sound was our car moving through the dense night. Sarah asked if I was sure we were going the right way. I wasn't, but I didn't want to admit it. I kept driving, hoping to find a main road soon. After what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights behind us. A truck was coming up fast. It was strange because we hadn't seen another car for miles. The truck got closer and closer, its high beams blinding us through the rearview mirror. Sarah turned around, looking worried. The truck was tailgating us, almost pushing us to go faster. I sped up, but the truck matched our speed. It was too close for comfort. Then, without warning, it pulled up beside us, trying to force us off the road. I swerved to avoid it, nearly losing control. My heart was pounding, and Sarah was gripping the seat. We came to a fork in the road. In a panic, I took the left turn. The truck followed. It was a dead end. The gravel path led to an open field surrounded by thick woods. The truck blocked the only exit. 4 men got out. They were big, burly, and looked like they meant business. Sarah whispered for us to stay calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The men approached, one of them carrying a baseball bat. I locked the doors and told Sarah to call the police, but there was no signal. The man with the bat knocked on the driver's side window, hard. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said, his voice dripping with menace. I shook my head, trying to explain we were lost, but he wasn't listening. He smashed the window with the bat, glass flying everywhere. Sarah screamed. They dragged me out first, then pulled Sarah from the car. They threw me to the ground, kicking me in the ribs. The pain was intense, but my fear for Sarah was worse. One of them grabbed her by the arm, yanking her towards the truck. I tried to get up, but another kick sent me sprawling. I could hear Sarah pleading with them, but it only seemed to amuse them. They were discussing what to do with us, their words cruel and casual. Desperation gave me strength. I managed to get to my feet and lunged at the man holding Sarah. It was a clumsy attack, but it surprised him enough to loosen his grip. Sarah broke free and ran towards the woods. I followed, the men shouting behind us. We crashed through the underbrush, branches scratching our faces and hands. I didn't know where we were going, but anywhere was better than back there. The sound of our pursuers faded as we put distance between us. We kept running until we couldn't hear them anymore, then collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping for breath. Sarah was crying softly, and I held her close, trying to think. We couldn't go back to the car, and we had no idea where we were. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. We decided to keep moving, hoping to find a road or a house. Hours seemed to pass. The night was endless, and every sound made us jump. We stumbled onto a dirt path and followed it, praying it would lead somewhere safe. Eventually, we saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small farmhouse. We approached cautiously, not sure if we could trust whoever lived there. I knocked on the door, and an old man answered. He looked surprised to see us, but didn't seem threatening. We explained what had happened, and he let us in, giving us water and a place to sit. The old man called the police for us. While we waited, he told us stories about the area, about how people sometimes disappeared in those woods. It sent chills down my spine, knowing how close we had come to being one of those stories. The police arrived and took our statements. They went to investigate the area, but I doubted they'd find the men. They were too experienced, too familiar with the terrain. We were taken to the station, and our families were called. Seeing them again was a relief I couldn't describe. That night changed us. We never spoke about it much afterward, trying to put it behind us. But every time we drive at night, I feel that familiar tension, and I know Sarah does too. I thought stopping at the rest area for a quick break was a good idea. I had been driving for hours, and it was getting late. The rest area was mostly empty, just a couple of other cars parked and the dim glow of a vending machine. I parked my car and went to stretch my legs and use the restroom. The air was cool, and the night was quiet. When I came back, my car looked the same as I had left it. Same make, model, and color. I got in, feeling relieved to get back on the road. But something felt off. The seat was pushed back further than I usually have it, and there was a faint smell of cigarette smoke. I didn't smoke. I checked the glove compartment, which was usually empty, but now it had a couple of packs of cigarettes and a map. That's when I noticed a duffel bag on the back seat that wasn't mine. I opened it and found stacks of money, some jewelry, and a few small bags of what looked like drugs. My heart started pounding. This wasn't my car. Before I could figure out what to do, I saw two men approaching from the direction of the restrooms. They were looking right at me. Panic set in, and I started the car and sped off. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I needed to get away from them and figure out what was going on. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror. They got into another car and were following me. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't let them catch me. The highway was dark, and there weren't many cars around. I took the next exit, hoping to lose them in the back roads. The winding roads were a blur as I tried to put distance between us. I could see their headlights getting closer. My mind raced with thoughts. How had my car been swapped? Why me? I didn't have time to think about it. I needed to find a safe place to stop and call for help. I spotted a small gas station up ahead and pulled in, hoping they wouldn't follow me there. The station was closed, but the lights were still on. I parked near the entrance and ran to the payphone. My hands were trembling as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained my situation, giving them my location. While waiting for the police, I kept an eye on the road. The men's car drove past the gas station, but then it slowed down and turned around. They were coming back. I felt a surge of fear. I looked around for somewhere to hide and saw a storage shed behind the station. I ran to the shed and squeezed inside, trying to control my breathing. Through a crack in the door, I saw their car pull into the gas station. They got out and started looking around. One of them was on the phone, probably talking to someone about the situation. They were searching for me, getting closer to the shed. I held my breath as one of them walked past the shed, flashlight in hand. He stopped, and for a moment, I thought he had seen me. But then he moved on. I waited until they were out of sight before slowly creeping out of the shed. Just then, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The men heard it too and started running back to their car. I stayed hidden until I saw the police cars pull into the station. The men tried to speed away, but the police blocked their path. The police quickly arrested them and searched their car. I came out of hiding and explained everything to the officers. They checked the duffel bag in the car and confirmed it was full of stolen goods. They took my statement and helped me figure out what had happened. Apparently, the men had stolen my car while I was in the restroom and replaced it with an identical one loaded with stolen items. They were planning to retrieve their loot and leave me to take the fall. If I hadn't noticed the difference and driven off, I would have been in serious trouble. The police found my real car abandoned a few miles away. I was shaken but relieved to have it back. They assured me that the men would be facing serious charges and that I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear and disbelief. It was a close call, too close. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed the switch or if I had been caught by those men. I had just finished a long day at work and was exhausted. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was standing outside my office building waiting for my rideshare. The city streets were quiet, and there weren't many people around. I kept checking my phone, watching the little car icon move closer on the app. Finally, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window and smiled at me. "Rachel?" he asked. I nodded and got in, settling into the back seat. The car smelled faintly of air freshener, and the driver had some soft music playing on the radio. It felt nice to finally be on my way home. At first, Everything seemed normal. He started driving, and I looked out the window, lost in my thoughts. But after a few minutes, I noticed we were going the wrong way. I leaned forward and said, "I think you're going the wrong direction." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror and smiled again, but this time it felt off. "Don't worry, I know a shortcut," he said. His tone was too casual, too confident. My stomach tightened. I opened the rideshare app to check the route. The app showed a different path, one that led straight to my apartment. "This doesn't look like a shortcut," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned down a side street that I didn't recognize. The buildings around us were getting fewer and farther between. Panic started to rise in my chest. "Hey, can you just follow the route on the app?" I asked, more forcefully this time. He ignored me, driving even faster. My heart was pounding now. I tried to open the door, but the child lock was on. "Let me out," I shouted. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You're not going anywhere." I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but he reached back and grabbed it from my hand. "No calls," he said, tossing it into the front seat. I was trapped. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but found nothing. The car sped through dark, unfamiliar streets. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out. We pulled into an abandoned industrial area. He stopped the car and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. He turned to face me, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. "Get out," he ordered. I hesitated, but he yanked open the door and dragged me out. I stumbled and fell to the ground. The asphalt was rough against my hands and knees. "Please, just let me go," I begged. He laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You're mine now," he said. Desperation took over. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not looking back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I saw a faint light in the distance and headed toward it, my lungs burning and legs aching. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was a gas station. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. The attendant looked up in surprise. "Help me," I managed to say. The driver had stopped at the edge of the parking lot, watching me. I could see his silhouette in the darkness. The attendant quickly called the police and stayed with me until they arrived. The driver disappeared before they got there, but I gave them his description and the details of what happened. It took a long time for me to feel safe again. The police never found him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I started taking different routes home, always checking my surroundings, never letting my guard down. That night changed everything for me. I realized how quickly things could go wrong, how a simple mistake could lead to something terrifying. I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, the feeling of being trapped and helpless. But I also learned that I could fight, that I could survive, even when things seemed hopeless. Now, whenever I get into a rideshare, I double-check the license plate and the driver's photo. I never let my guard down, always staying alert. It's a small price to pay for my safety, a lesson learned the hard way. I was driving back home late one night. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark. I had spent the day visiting my parents and was now looking forward to getting back to my own bed. The highway was quiet. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustle of the wind. I felt at ease, enjoying the solitude and the peace of the night drive. About halfway home, I noticed some bright lights ahead. As I got closer, I saw what looked like a construction site. Orange cones lined the road, and men in reflective vests were standing around, waving flashlights. I slowed down, thinking it was some late-night road work. One of the men, holding a stop sign, motioned for me to pull over. I rolled down my window and asked, "What's going on?" "Just some routine maintenance," he said, his voice steady but eyes too focused. "We need everyone to take a detour." I nodded and followed his directions, turning onto a side road as indicated. As soon as I did, the atmosphere changed. The road was narrow and surrounded by thick trees. It felt too quiet, too isolated. I kept driving, hoping to see a sign pointing me back to the main road. Suddenly, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck was coming up fast behind me. My heart started pounding. Something didn't feel right. The truck got closer, almost tailgating me. I sped up a little, trying to shake off the unease. Out of nowhere, another set of headlights appeared ahead. Another truck, blocking the road. Panic surged through me. This wasn't normal. I hit the brakes and tried to turn around, but the truck behind me was too close. I was trapped. The men from the supposed construction site were getting out of the trucks now, approaching my car. Their faces were hard, no longer hiding behind friendly masks. One of them banged on my window with a flashlight. "Get out of the car," he demanded. I fumbled to lock my doors and rolled up the window. My hands were shaking, and I could barely think straight. I looked around for any possible escape route, but there was nothing but trees and darkness. "Open the door now!" The man's voice was angry, threatening. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get out of this. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas. The car lurched backward, and I steered wildly, trying to avoid the men. The car screeched as I turned sharply, managing to create a small gap between my car and the trucks. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my heart racing, my mind focused on getting out of there. I found myself on a rough, narrow path, barely wide enough for my car. Branches scraped against the sides, but I didn't care. I kept going, hoping this path would lead me back to safety. After what felt like forever, I saw a faint light in the distance. I headed towards it, praying it was a sign of civilization. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station. I pulled in, my tires screeching, and jumped out of the car, running inside. The attendant looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Help me," I gasped. "There are men," they tried to. I couldn't finish my sentence. The attendant quickly locked the door and called the police. I stayed inside, trembling, my eyes darting to the windows, expecting those men to appear at any moment. The police arrived within minutes. They took my statement and assured me they would search the area. They escorted me back to my car and followed me home, making sure I was safe. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men, felt the terror of being trapped. It took days for the fear to subside, but I knew I had to be more cautious. That night taught me how quickly things can turn dangerous, how a simple drive can turn into a nightmare. I never found out who those men were or what they wanted, but I was grateful I managed to escape. It was a quiet night when Megan and I decided to take a break at a secluded rest stop. We had been driving for hours, and the need to stretch our legs and use the restroom was becoming unbearable. The rest stop was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, and the only light came from a single flickering street lamp. The air was cold, and a light mist clung to the ground, adding to the eerie atmosphere. We pulled in and parked the car. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. Megan and I got out, looking around for any sign of life. There was none. We decided to take turns, one of us staying with the car while the other used the restroom. Megan went first, leaving me to lean against the hood of the car, staring into the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. I was starting to get uneasy when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained my eyes to see what it was. Nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. I shook off the feeling and glanced towards the restroom building, waiting for Megan to return. Suddenly, I heard a muffled scream from the direction of the restrooms. Panic surged through me. I called out for Megan, but there was no response. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and ran towards the sound. As I rounded the corner, I saw her struggling against a man who had her pinned against the wall. Another man stood nearby, holding a gun. "Let her go!" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. The man with the gun turned towards me, his eyes cold and menacing. He stepped forward, pointing the weapon at me, and I froze. Megan's eyes were wide with terror, silently pleading for help. "Back off," the man growled. "Or you both die here." My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I couldn't leave Megan, but I was unarmed and outnumbered. Slowly, I raised my hands, showing I wasn't a threat. "Please, just let us go. We don't have anything valuable. Just let us go." The man didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for his accomplice to bring Megan closer. They began dragging her towards a van parked behind the rest stop, hidden from view. Desperation took over, and I knew I had to act fast. I glanced around, spotting a large rock on the ground. Without thinking, I lunged for it and threw it at the gunman. The rock hit his arm, causing him to stumble and the gun to fall from his grasp. Megan took the chance to break free, kicking the other man and running towards me. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing her hand. We sprinted back towards the car, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The gunman was shouting, and I could hear the other man chasing us. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, the car roared to life. Megan jumped into the passenger seat, and I slammed on the gas, tearing out of the rest stop. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men standing there, watching us disappear into the night. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. We drove in silence for a while, neither of us daring to speak. The reality of what just happened slowly sank in, and I felt a wave of relief that we had escaped. Megan was crying softly, and I reached over to squeeze her hand, trying to comfort her. Eventually, we found a well-lit gas station and pulled in. We were safe, but the fear still lingered. We reported the incident to the police, who assured us they would investigate. But I knew it would be a long time before I could shake the memory of that night. From that day on, we never stopped at secluded rest stops again. The world felt different, more dangerous. It was around midnight when I decided to take the back roads home. The main highway was closed for construction, and I figured the country roads would be faster and quieter. I didn't mind the silence, but it was a bit eerie driving through the dark, empty roads with only my headlights cutting through the blackness. As I turned a corner, I saw a woman standing on the side of the road. She looked distressed, waving her arms frantically. I hesitated for a moment, but then I thought about how I'd want someone to stop for me if I was in trouble. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Are you okay?" I asked. She looked to be in her late 20s, with disheveled hair and tears streaming down her face. "Please, can you help me? I'm running away from my boyfriend. He's been hitting me. I just need to get to the next town." My heart went out to her. "Of course, get in," I said, unlocking the door. She climbed into the passenger seat, still sobbing. I noticed she didn't have any belongings with her, which struck me as odd, but I figured she left in a hurry. As we drove, she told me about her abusive boyfriend, how she had to escape before he killed her. I felt a mix of sympathy and anger towards the man who did this to her. She asked if I could drop her off at a gas station where a friend was supposed to pick her up. I agreed, trying to comfort her as best as I could. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car following us. It was keeping a steady distance but mimicking every turn I made. "Do you think that's him?" I asked, my voice shaky. She glanced back and then turned to me, her expression changing. "It might be. Just keep driving." I pressed the gas pedal a bit harder, my anxiety rising. The car behind us sped up too, closing the gap. My heart was pounding in my chest. "What do we do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Take the next left," she instructed. I did as she said, but the car followed. "Pull over," she suddenly said, a strange edge in her voice. "Why?" I asked, confused and scared. "Just do it," she snapped. I pulled over reluctantly, my mind racing with fear. She opened the door and got out, walking towards the car that had been following us. My blood ran cold as I watched her get into the car. She wasn't running from anyone, she was setting me up. I fumbled for my phone, trying to dial 911, but my hands were shaking too much. The car door opened, and a large man stepped out, walking towards me with a menacing grin. "Get out of the car," he said, pulling a gun from his waistband. I froze, my mind screaming at me to move, but my body wouldn't listen. He reached the driver's side and yanked the door open, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me out. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Just your car," he said, pushing me to the ground. "And maybe a little something extra if you don't cooperate." I glanced at the woman, who was now standing next to the car, smirking. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "People do desperate things for money," she replied coldly. The man rummaged through my pockets, taking my phone and wallet. "Please, just take the car and go," I begged. He chuckled, shoving me harder against the ground. "We're going to take everything you have," he said, "including your dignity if you don't shut up." Tears streamed down my face as I realized how helpless I was. But then, I saw a glimmer of hope. Another car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "Help!" I screamed, hoping the driver would hear me. The man cursed under his breath, yanking me to my feet. "Get in the car," he ordered, pushing me towards the back seat. The woman climbed into the passenger seat, and he jumped into the driver's seat. They sped off, leaving me standing on the side of the road, trembling and in shock. The approaching car stopped, and a middle-aged couple got out. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his face full of concern. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "They stole my car," I managed to say between sobs. "They had a gun." The couple comforted me, calling the police and staying with me until they arrived. The officers took my statement, assuring me they would do everything they could to find the carjackers. But deep down, I knew they were long gone. The rest of the night was a blur of police lights and questions. I felt violated and scared, my trust in humanity shattered. It was late, around midnight, when I decided to stop at a remote gas station. I had been driving for hours, and my tank was running low. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. The place looked old and run down, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled up to the pump, got out of my car, and started to fill the tank. The air was still, and the only sound was the hum of the gas pump. I glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy. There were no other cars, and the station seemed deserted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. As I finished pumping the gas, the door to the small convenience store opened. Two men stepped out, both wearing greasy overalls and dirty caps. They looked at me with cold, assessing eyes. I tried to smile and nod, but they didn't respond. Instead, they walked over, stopping a few feet away from me. "Need anything else?" one of them asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Just gas, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The other man, taller and more muscular, leaned against the pump, blocking my way back to the car. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Just passing through," I said, keeping my eyes on the pump, willing it to finish. The tall man chuckled. "Not many people come through here at this time of night," he said. "You sure you don't need anything else? Maybe some directions?" "No, I'm good. Just need to get back on the road," I said, my heart pounding. The pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full. I reached to grab the nozzle, but the first man stepped closer, blocking my way. "We got a problem, though," he said, his tone changing. "Looks like your card didn't go through." I frowned, pulling out my wallet. "That's strange. Let me try again." He shook his head. "No need for that. We'll take cash." I hesitated, then pulled out a few bills and handed them over. The man took them, his eyes never leaving mine. "This ain't enough," he said, crumpling the money in his fist. "It's all I have," I lied, trying to stay calm. The tall man moved even closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "That's a shame," he said. "Maybe we can work something out." My pulse quickened. "I really need to get going," I said, edging towards my car. The first man grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "I don't think you're going anywhere," he said, his voice menacing. I yanked my arm free, adrenaline surging through me. "Let go of me," I shouted. The tall man pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. "I think you should listen to my friend," he said, his tone deadly serious. Panic set in. I glanced around, looking for any way out. The store was too far, and my car was blocked. I had to think fast. Okay, I said, raising my hands. "Just take what you want." The first man smirked, reaching for my wallet again. But before he could grab it, I swung the gas nozzle, hitting him in the face. He stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted towards my car, yanking the door open. The tall man lunged at me, but I slammed the door shut, locking it just in time. He pounded on the window, shouting obscenities. My hand shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw the two men running after me, but I didn't slow down. My heart raced as I drove, not daring to look back again. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally pulled over, my hands still trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had escaped, but the fear lingered. I knew I would never forget the faces of those men and the terror they brought with them. It was just past midnight when I decided to take the long run home. I like driving at night. The roads were empty and it gave me time to clear my head. I was about halfway through the stretch of highway when I saw a car on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. Normally, I wouldn't stop. I've read too many stories about people being ambushed, but something about this seemed different. There was a man standing by the car, waving his arms. He looked genuinely desperate. I pulled over a few yards ahead and got out, leaving my engine running. "Hey, you need some help?" I called out, keeping my distance. The man jogged up to me, looking relieved. "Thank you. My car broke down and my phone's dead. Could you give me a lift to the nearest gas station?" I hesitated, looking him over. He seemed harmless enough, just a guy in his mid-30s with a worried expression. "Sure, hop in," I said, deciding to trust my gut. He climbed into the passenger seat, and I started driving again. "I'm Ethan, by the way," I said, trying to break the awkward silence. "Jake," he replied. "Thanks again for this." I was starting to think I'd be stuck out here all night. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept glancing over at him. Something about his demeanor was off. He was fidgety, kept looking out the window and then back at me. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Engine overheated," he said quickly. "Been having problems with it for a while." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Something just didn't add up. I decided to keep my suspicions to myself and focused on the road. We were about 10 miles from the nearest gas station when I noticed another set of headlights behind us. They were getting closer, fast. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. It was another car, speeding up to tail us. "Do you know those guys?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Jake looked back and then turned to me, his face pale. "Just drive faster," he said, his voice tight. I pressed down on the gas, but the car behind us matched my speed. My heart was pounding now, the realization of the situation hitting me hard. This was a setup. "What's going on, Jake?" I demanded. "They're my friends," he admitted, not meeting my eyes. "Just pull over, and no one gets hurt." I glanced at him, anger and fear bubbling up. "You're trying to hijack my truck?" He didn't respond, just reached into his jacket. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. I swerved hard to the right, sending him crashing into the door. He shouted, grabbing the dashboard to steady himself. I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed it to its limit. The car behind us was still on our tail, their headlights blinding in the mirrors. I had to think fast. "Look, man, you don't have to do this," I said, trying to buy myself some time. "Just let me go, and I won't tell anyone." Jake shook his head, pulling out a small gun. "Just stop the truck, Ethan. It doesn't have to get messy." I spotted a rest stop up ahead, barely lit by a few dim lights. It was my only chance. I veered off the highway, the tires screeching as I pulled into the rest stop. The other car followed, but I didn't slow down. I aimed for a narrow gap between two parked trucks, hoping to lose them. Jake was yelling now, the gun shaking in his hand. I didn't care. I had to get out of this alive. We shot through the gap, the side mirrors scraping against the trucks. The car behind us tried to follow but got stuck. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I slammed on the brakes, yanked the door open, and jumped out, running towards the lit area of the rest stop. Jake stumbled out of the truck, chasing after me. "Get back here," he shouted. I ignored him. My only thought was to get to safety. I saw a small building ahead, probably the restrooms, and sprinted towards it. I could hear Jake's footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I reached the building and burst inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in gasps. I heard Jake pounding on the door, shouting threats. I had to think of something, fast. I looked around the small restroom, my mind racing. There was a window above the sink, barely big enough to squeeze through. I climbed up, struggling to push it open. The pounding on the door grew louder, more frantic. Finally, the window gave way, and I pulled myself through, landing hard on the ground outside. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I got up and ran, heading towards the highway. I could hear Jake shouting, but he didn't follow me. I kept running, my legs burning, until I reached the road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a mix of relief and fear washing over me when they stopped. "Please, help me," I gasped. "I've been attacked." The driver, an older man, looked concerned. "Get in, son. Let's get you to the police." I climbed into the car, my hands still shaking. As we drove away, I looked back at the rest stop, the lights fading into the distance. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a long day at work. The roads were mostly empty, and I was making good time. The quiet of the drive was soothing, until I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, it didn't bother me much. The car behind was a bit too close, but I figured it was just a driver in a hurry. I changed lanes to let them pass, but they didn't overtake. Instead, they stayed right on my tail. I could see their headlights glaring through my mirror, and it was starting to annoy me. I tapped my brakes slightly, hoping to get them to back off. The car behind didn't react the way I expected. Instead of slowing down, it seemed to accelerate a bit, keeping up with me and even getting closer. I started to get uneasy. I didn't want to escalate things, but I was beginning to feel like I needed to do something. I changed lanes again, hoping they'd pass, but they just followed. This went on for a few miles. Every time I thought they'd finally overtake, they stayed right there. My heart was starting to race. I knew something wasn't right. When I reached a stretch of road with no streetlights, I decided to pull over and let them pass. I stopped at the side of the road and waited, my headlights casting long shadows on the dark pavement. The car behind me didn't pass. Instead, it slowed down and stopped a short distance behind me. I felt a knot in my stomach. I turned on my hazard lights and watched as the car door opened. A man stepped out, and I could see him moving towards my car. My instincts told me to get out of there. Before he reached my window, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man getting back into his car. He followed me, this time with a more aggressive pace. Panic set in as I realized he was trying to block me in. I sped up, but so did he. His car was now tailgating me, and I could see his high beams reflecting off my mirror. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking on the wheel. The road began to twist and turn as I approached a remote area. The car behind was relentless, trying to push me off the road with every maneuver. I could see the driver's face now, his expression a mix of anger and determination. I spotted a sign for a gas station up ahead and made a split-second decision to head there. Maybe I could lose him in the parking lot. I pulled in, the tires screeching as I made the turn. The gas station was deserted, just a few dim lights casting eerie shadows. I parked near the entrance, hoping the lights would deter him. I watched as his car followed me into the lot, his headlights illuminating the entire area. I saw him get out of his car and approach mine. I locked the doors and tried to keep my cool. I was hoping the security cameras at the gas station might catch something. The man reached my window and knocked hard, making me jump. "Get out of the car," he yelled, his voice filled with rage. I didn't respond. I knew that if I got out, things could get a lot worse. I looked around, hoping for someone to show up. But the place was as empty as I had feared. He started banging on the window, trying to break it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could hear the dispatcher's calm voice on the other end as I explained the situation. While I talked, I watched him trying to force the door open. His anger was palpable, and it only made me more terrified. I could hear his shouting getting louder, mixed with threats. He seemed to realize that he wasn't getting in and started to pace back and forth. I kept an eye on him through the mirror. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity. I tried to stay as low as possible, my heart pounding with every noise he made. Suddenly, I saw flashing lights in the distance. Relief washed over me as I realized it was the police. The man saw them too and quickly jumped back into his car. He sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. The officers arrived shortly after, and I got out of my car, still shaking. They checked the security footage from the gas station and took my statement. They assured me they'd look into it, but they couldn't promise anything. I waited for a while, making sure everything was okay before finally heading home. The drive back was unnervingly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I got home, I locked the doors and checked every window. I kept replaying the night in my head, the fear gripping me tightly. It wasn't a night I forget easily, but at least I was safe. I was driving home late at night, taking my usual route through the outskirts of town. The road was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. Out of nowhere, I saw headlights flashing in the distance, and as I got closer, I realized it was a car accident. At first, it looked like a serious crash. The vehicle was flipped on its side, and there were some lights flickering, which made me think there might be people in trouble. I hesitated for a moment but then decided I should stop and help. It was dark and desolate, and I couldn't ignore it. I parked my car a little distance away, just enough to stay out of the way but close enough to offer assistance. As I got out, I noticed that the scene looked odd. The car was severely damaged, but there was no sign of an injured person outside. It was unsettling, but I brushed off the feeling and approached cautiously. I saw a man standing by the wreck, looking disoriented. He had a flashlight and was waving it around as if trying to signal someone. I asked if he needed help and if there were any injured people. He told me that his friend was inside the car and needed urgent help. I moved closer to the car, trying to peer inside. The man started talking to me more urgently, saying that they were stranded and needed someone to call for emergency services. I reached for my phone to dial 911, but the man suddenly grabbed my arm. "Please, you need to help us," he said, his voice tense. "The phone lines are down. Just get us out of here." That's when I noticed a second person standing behind the wrecked car, just out of view. My gut twisted with unease. Something didn't seem right, but I tried to ignore it and focused on helping. I moved to the car, but as I got closer, I saw that the inside was empty. There was no sign of an injured person. The man's demeanor changed suddenly. He looked more aggressive and kept telling me to move faster. I felt a chill run down my spine. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I started to back away, but the man stepped in front of me. Just then, the second person emerged from the shadows. He had a menacing look and a heavy set of tools that looked out of place. I started to realize that this was a setup. My heart raced, and I knew I had to find a way out quickly. "Listen," I said, trying to stay calm. "I think I should just call the police. I'm not comfortable with this." Before I could reach my car, the second person advanced, and I saw something glinting in his hand, maybe a weapon. My mind was racing as I tried to think of a plan. I could see the man's anger growing, and I knew I had to act fast. I turned and sprinted back to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The two men were shouting, but I didn't turn around. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I backed out of the area as quickly as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror to see the two men still standing by the wreck, watching me. I drove as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station that was still open. I was out of breath and shaking. Inside the gas station, I told the clerk what happened and asked him to call the police. I waited there, my mind racing with what could have happened if I had stayed any longer. The clerk seemed worried and kept glancing out the window. Eventually, the police arrived, and I gave them a detailed description of the men and the incident. They assured me they'd send officers to investigate the scene. I felt a small wave of relief knowing that they would check it out, but the encounter had left me deeply unsettled. I drove home slowly, making sure no one was following me. The quiet of the night felt heavy, and every little sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the fear of what could have happened if I hadn't left when I did. When I finally made it home, I locked all the doors and made sure everything was secure. I kept thinking about those men and their intentions. The incident replayed in my mind over and over. It was a night I would never forget. I had been driving the night shift for a few months now. It was usually quiet, just me and the endless dark roads. On this particular night, I was nearing the end of my shift when I got a call for a pickup on the outskirts of town. The address was a bit off the beaten path, but it wasn't unusual for me to get these kinds of requests. I arrived at the location, a dimly lit area with barely any streetlights. The passenger was waiting by the side of the road, a man in his late 40s, wearing a heavy coat despite the mild weather. His appearance was nondescript, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. I shrugged it off as just nerves and got out of the cab to help him with his bag. He climbed into the back seat, and I got in front and started driving. He didn't say much at first, which was unusual but not alarming. I glanced in the rearview mirror a few times. The man seemed to be fiddling with something, but I couldn't see clearly. We were driving through a more remote part of town, and I noticed the streets getting emptier. I asked him where we were headed, trying to make small talk, but he just gave me a vague answer about heading to a special place. That was when I began to feel a real sense of unease. He finally spoke up and said, "I hope you're ready for a long ride. It's going to be quite a journey." His tone was calm but had an edge to it that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to keep the conversation going, asking about his plans or what brought him out here, but he deflected every question. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. The darkness outside was thick, and the only light came from the street lamps that flickered intermittently. The man's silence was unsettling. I glanced at him again in the rearview mirror and saw him moving something around in his lap. I couldn't make out what it was, but it looked like a metallic object. I decided to take a different route, hoping to shake off whatever this was. As I turned down a side road, the man's demeanor shifted. He sat up straighter and said, "You know, this is where most people get lost." His voice was cold, and I could feel the air in the cab grow heavier. A knot formed in my stomach. I realized I was deep in unfamiliar territory, with no clear way back. I tried to stay calm and asked if he wanted to change destinations. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence was almost unbearable. Finally, he said, "No, let's keep going. I've got a surprise for you." His tone was oddly cheerful, but there was something threatening in his voice. My mind raced. I knew I had to find a way to get out of this situation. I pulled over at a small, deserted area that seemed to be an old storage lot. I told him I needed to make a quick call, hoping to buy some time. I got out of the cab, pretending to call my dispatcher while keeping an eye on him. The man watched me intently but didn't move. As I was about to get back in, I saw him reaching into his coat. My heart raced, and I knew I had to act quickly. I got back in the cab and started the engine. The man looked surprised but didn't immediately react. I drove off as fast as I could, taking sharp turns and making erratic maneuvers to see if he was following. After a few minutes of driving like a maniac, I saw that the man wasn't behind me anymore. I felt a brief sense of relief but knew I wasn't out of danger yet. I headed back towards the main roads, trying to stay alert for any signs of being followed. Every car that passed felt like it could be him or someone he had sent after me. I finally reached a well-lit area with a gas station. I pulled over and went inside, where I told the clerk what had happened and asked him to call the police. I waited inside the gas station, my hands still shaking. I watched through the window, half expecting to see the man's car pull up. The police arrived and took my statement, but by then, I was sure he was long gone. The rest of the night was a blur of worry and exhaustion. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and checked the perimeter of my house more times than I care to admit. The whole experience left me shaken and on edge. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. It was a long night, and it took a while before I could get any sleep.